Long before the first empire carved its name into stone, long before the pyramids rose from the desert sands, or bronze first tasted fire, the earth turned under a quieter story. It was not the story of kings or battles, nor of monuments or miracles. It was the story of a plant, small and unassuming, that waited patiently in the river valleys and wind-swept plateaus of an ancient world that had not yet learned to write its own memory. Imagine, if you will, the cold dawn of a forgotten spring in Central Asia. The sky is a pale, sleeping grey, and a thin mist clings to the lowlands, as if the earth itself is exhaling after a long, frozen night. Along the banks of a nameless river, grasses bend under beads of dew, and among them there is another shape, a stalk rising straight and slender, its leaves long and serrated, each one like the blade of a tiny green spear. The plant does not yet have a name. It knows nothing of medicine or law, of sanctity or sin. It only knows the turning of the sun and the quiet pull of water through its veins. Nearby, a small band of nomads moves slowly through the valley. Their clothes are made of animal skins, their tools of bone and stone, their stories carried only in the shifting wind of spoken words. They have followed the herds across these steppes for generations beyond counting, reading the land as one might read a sacred text. They know which roots heal, and which berries kill. They know which trees give bow-making wood and which grasses feed their animals. But this plant, this tall and fibrous stranger, catches their attention. They notice that its stalk, when dried and split, yields long threads stronger than many they have known. They notice that its seeds, small and hard, can be roasted and eaten, offering enetic richness in seasons of hunger. When they burn the plant's resinous flowers upon their small fires to drive away insects, they notice something else, a gentle shift in the air, a softening of the hard edges of the world. Their bodies grow lighter, their sorrows for a moment become less sharp. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurs. In this way, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a partnership begins. The people do not yet call it cannabis, or hemp, or marijuana. It bears no burden of law or legend. It is simply there, green and patient, sharing the world with early wheat, young barley, wild onions, and the first trembling orchards that humans coax from the soil. They carry its seeds in small leather pouches as they wander, letting them fall wherever they rest for a season. And in time, thin green shoots rise behind them like a quiet, trailing memory. As centuries unwind like unspooled thread, the rivers carve deeper channels, and the nomads become settlers. Villages bloom along the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, in the valleys of the Yellow River, on the banks of the Indus. Mud brick houses rise, fields appear as rectangles of human intention etched into the wild earth. In these first gardens of civilization, amid the orderly rows of grain and legumes, that familiar plant takes root again. In the shadow of the ziggurats of Sumer, where priests watch the movements of stars and inscribe the will of the gods onto soft clay, hemp stalks ripple in the Mesopotamian breeze. The people here have learned that its fibers can be twisted into cords and ropes, strong enough to bind beams and lift heavy stones. In the workshops where early merchants weigh barley and wool, sacks are tied with hempen twine. On the banks of canals, simple boats stitched and lashed together depend on these fibers to keep their shape. To the north, beyond the Black Sea, the Scythians ride their horses across open plains, swift as arrows. Their world is made of grass and sky, of wind and sudden violence. They too have come to know the plant with the serrated leaves. They use its fibers to string their bows, its seeds to nourish them on long journeys, its smoke to guide them through the mysteries of life and death. When one of their kings falls, they raise a mound over his grave, and beside his weapons and treasures, they leave hemp seeds in small leather bags, a final offering for the road beyond. But it is in the highlands farther east, in the cradle of what will one day be called China, that the plant begins to be understood, not only as a tool, but as medicine. Here in mountain valleys where mists cling to terraces of rice and mulberry, an old tale is told of a legendary ruler. They call him Shen Nung, the divine farmer, a half-mythic emperor who walks the fields in a robe the color of autumn leaves, tasting every herb of the land to learn which heal and which harm. In the stories, Shen Nung lives in an age when the boundary between the human and the divine is thin as a thread of smoke. He is said to possess a transparent body, so that as he consumes each plant he can watch its journeys through his veins and organs, observing the transformations it causes within him. One day he bends down to inspect a familiar green stalk growing near his fields, rubs its leaves between his fingers, and inhales its scent. It is sharp and earthy, with a hint of something elusive, like rain on dry soil. He tastes its seeds, he brews a decoction from its leaves and flowers. He waits, with the patience of one who has devoted his life to listening to the subtle language of nature. In time he feels the plant's gentle hand upon him. Pains ease, the tensions of thought loosen, the gates of sleep swing open more readily. In later ages, when his experiences are compiled into one of humanity's earliest known pharmacopeias, cannabis is there, recorded as a remedy for rheumatism, for the distracting pain of old age, for malaria, for disorders of the female body, and for the quiet torments of the mind. To the south, in the lands that will be called India, the air grows warm and heavy, fragrant with dust and flowers. Cows move slowly through narrow streets, and bells ring softly in the smoky light of dawn. Here the plant takes on yet another crushed between stones and mixed with spices, milk and honey. It becomes bhang, a sweet green drink carried in clay cups during festivals and rituals. In the myths chanted by temple priests, the god Shiva, lord of both destruction and renewal, is said to have rested in the cool shade of cannabis plants after his cosmic dances, soothed and nourished by their presence. In crowded markets along the Ganges, a wandering ascetic dips his fingers into a bowl of thick green paste, brings it slowly to his lips, and closes his eyes. He has renounced wealth, family, and comfort in search of a different kind of truth, a deeper rhythm that beats beneath the everyday clamor. As the plant's essence mingles with his blood, the world brightens at the edges. The clatter of carts and voices becomes a distant, calming hum. The boundary between his own small self and the larger, breathing tapestry of existence grows thin. To him this is not intoxication, it is communion. Farther west, in the valleys of Persia, where gardens bloom behind high walls and poets compare their beloved's eyebrows to the arc of a new moon, cannabis leaves rustle in the dry wind. Some will grind its flowers and mix them with dates and honey, creating confections that slow time and invite reflection. In cool courtyards shaded by cypress and pomegranate trees, scholars and mystics gather to recite verses and contemplate the nature of reality, their thoughts drifting on invisible currents, carried perhaps by the same plant that grows unnoticed by the roadside. In Egypt, along the slow, eternal curve of the Nile, there are hints, seeds found in tombs, fibers woven into ancient cloth, that suggest the plant was known there as well. A scribe bent over his papyrus may have dipped his reed pen in ink, and paused to loosen the pains in his neck and back, with an herb-infused oil. A healer trained in the wisdom of temples might have mixed ground cannabis with other plants, pressing the paste into poultices for swollen joints or inflamed skin. The evidence is scattered, fragmentary, like faint footprints in shifting sand, but together they whisper that the plant had walked quietly through these lands too. In all these places, on the Eurasian steppes, in Chinese valleys, along Indian rivers, in Persian gardens, beside the Nile, the same plant wears many names and many masks. Rope and remedy, sacred smoke and simple seed. It moves from field to temple, from kitchen to burial mound, gathering stories around itself as a rock in a river gathers layers of sediment through the centuries. No one calls it dangerous. No one sees in it the shadow of future wars or prison walls, for this is still the early part of its biography, when it is known primarily for what it gives: strength to fibers, ease to bodies, and for those who seek it, a gentle opening of the inner eye. In time, human societies grow more complex. Kingdoms rise and fall like the tides. Scripts evolve from pictographs to alphabets. Wheels cut deeper ruts into the earth. And in the bustling cities of Greece and Rome, where philosophers debate under colonnades, and ships crowd harbors heavy with goods from every corner of the known world, hemp finds new uses again. In workshops along the Aegean coast, craftsmen twist bundles of hemp fibers into ropes to rig their sailing ships. Under the Mediterranean sun, These ropes creak and strain as they hold taut against wind-filled sail. The plant that once grew unseen in Central Asian valleys now enables ambitious men to cross open water and knit far-flung lands together with trade and conquest. In Roman fields, hemp is sown in orderly rows, its stalks harvested to weave garments, sacks, and coarse cloth for the poor. As the empire expands, so too does the humble plant's domain. To the east, in the empire of the Han, Chinese artisans discover that hemp's fibers can be beaten and pressed into thin sheets. On these sheets, characters are brushed with ink, and history itself finds a new home. Along dusty roads, a traveler tucks a hemp paper scroll into his robe, carrying with him poems, laws, stories, and the accumulated wisdom of centuries. In this quiet way, the plant contributes not only to the physical infrastructure of civilization, but to its memory, its sense of itself. Yet while its fibers bind ships and documents, its flowers continue to bind human beings to realms less tangible. In the high plateaus and mountain fastnesses of Central Asia, the Scythians still build small, leather tents over the graves of their honored dead. Herodotus, the Greek historian, visiting their lands in the 5th century before the Common Era, watches them place hemp seeds upon red-hot stones. Watches as thick aromatic smoke fills the enclosed space. He hears the mourners' cries change timbre, their grief slipping into exultation, their anguish into a kind of fierce, wild joy. He writes of it in his histories with a mixture of fascination and foreignness, one more strange custom among many in the great tapestry of human manner. Across the centuries beyond the fall of Rome, past the slow dimming of old classical lights, the plant persists. In medieval Europe, monasteries rise like stone islands in seas of forest and field. Within their walled gardens, monks cultivate herbs for medicine, sage, rosemary, lavender, and also hemp. They know its usefulness for rope and cloth for binding manuscripts and mending fishing nets. Some perhaps know its more subtle effects, the way a tea made from its leaves may quiet a restless mind or ease the burden of chronic pain. In the cool scriptoria, by candlelight, bent figures ink lines of Latin into books, bound in wooden boards and leather straps, those very straps strengthened by fibers drawn from a plant they rarely main in their prayers, but cannot easily do without. Further south and east, under the crescent moon of the Islamic world, scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba preserve and expand the medical knowledge of Greece, India, and Persia. In the great libraries where lamps burn late into the night, physicians copy and comment on earlier texts. They note the properties of hashish, the resin collected from cannabis flowers, sticky as honey, dark as amber. Some praise its value in relieving pain and lifting melancholy, others warn of its excesses, of confusion and forgetfulness when taken in large amounts. In Sufi lodges, dervishes debate whether altered states induced by such substances bring one closer to the divine or merely create imitations of true spiritual ecstasy. Once again, the plant stands at a crossroads: medicine and poison, revelation and delusion, salvation and temptation, all contained within the same green veins. But history, like a river, does not stand still. Europeans, emerging slowly from centuries of plague and war, turn their eyes out. The Atlantic, once a boundary at the western edge of their maps, becomes a highway of possibility. Shipyards spring up along the coasts of Portugal, Spain, France, and England, filling the air with the sounds of hammers and saws, of voices shouting over the creak of timbers and the crash of waves. In these yards, hemp becomes indispensable. Picture a vast wooden ship under construction, its keel laid, its ribs rising like the bones of some enormous animal. It waits to be clothed in planks and masts and rigging. To transform this skeleton into a living, moving vessel, thousands of meters of rope are required, ropes to hoist and lower the sails, to anchor the ship, to secure the cannons, to bind the barrels in which food and water will be carried. Each of these ropes begins as a harvest in the fields, order upon order of green stalks rising in straight lines, swaying gently in the midland breezes of France, the riverlands of Germany, the damp soils of England and Russia. Women and men work together to cut and dry the stalks, to break them, to comb out the long fibers within. In rope walks, long straight buildings that seem themselves like stretched out cords, teams of workers twist and spin the fibers into strands, and the strands into ropes thick as a man's arm. In sail lofts, wider fibers are woven into canvas, sheets of fabric so enormous that they resemble fields in mid-air, set to catch the invisible force of the wind. When at last a ship like Columbus's Santa Maria or Magellan's Trinidad rides at anchor, ready to depart into unknown waters, it is largely held together, in all its vulnerable strength, by the plant that once grew wild and nameless in distant valleys. As the age of sail unfolds, hemp journeys to every corner of the globe. European powers dedicate entire regions to its cultivation. In Russia, vast estates are given over to the plant, the long north summers and rich soils producing fibers prized across the continent. English administrators worry anxiously about their supply of Russian hemp, for without it, the Royal Navy would be hobbled. Wars are fought in part to secure the raw materials that allow ships to be built and maintained. Empires rise on walls of canvas, fed by the pulsing hearts of forests and fields, and by the quiet vegetable labor of cannabis. When the first English settlers cross the ocean to the shores of North America, they bring with them not only their language and their faith, but their seeds. Among the wheat, barley, and flax are also hemp seeds, carefully wrapped and guarded. The soil of Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut is soon impressed into this old partnership. Colonial governments, aware of hemp's strategic value, pass laws requiring its cultivation. Farmers who might prefer to sow other crops are reminded of their duty. The Navy needs rope, the merchants need sails. The New World must not be dependent on faraway fields for such a crucial resource. In time, prominent figures of the American founding era join this agricultural effort. On the rolling plantation of Mount Vernon, George Washington instructs his overseers to sow hemp and notes its progress in his meticulous diaries, commenting on techniques that might improve the yield. At Monticello, Thomas Jefferson experiments with different seeds and soils, intrigued by the plant's versatility and economic promise. For them, for their neighbors, hemp is no more controversial than flax or cotton. It is a crop, a tool of nation building, a means by which the new republic may strengthen its independence. In those days, the plant still lives under a constellation of practical meanings. It is rope and canvas, sackcloth and paper, seed and oil. Its psychoactive flowers are known in some circles, used in certain medicines, and by some as a mild intoxicant, but they do not yet hold the center of its story. The idea that this plant might one day be treated as an enemy of the state, that it might be hunted, criminalized, and feared, would have seemed to those early farmers as strange as criminalizing wheat. Yet, history, as ever, is full of inversion. As the 19th century wanes and the 20th begins, the United States is changing. Factories grow like steel forests along rivers and railroads. Cities swell with immigrants. The old rural rhythms that once governed agricultural life give way to the ticking of clocks and the churning of machines. In the American Southwest, another story unfolds, its roots tangled with revolution, migration, and fear. Across the Rio Grande, Mexico is convulsed by political upheaval. Revolution shakes the countryside. General after general raises armies and falls. Peasants, caught between landlords, warlords, and poverty, seek safety wherever they can find it. Many cross northward into Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California, carrying with them their customs, their language, their music, and their relationship with the cannabis plant. For generations in their own lands, they have rolled its dried flowers into small cigarettes, or packed them into simple clay pipes. They inhale the smoke slowly, letting it curl through their lungs, exhaling into the hot desert air. For them, as for so many others across history, the plant is a modest companion. It eases the weight of long days in the fields, softens the ache in worn-out bodies, lends song and laughter a slightly brighter hue at the end of exhausting week. They call it marijuana, a word with soft vowels and a music of its own, perhaps a fusion of older local names. To their ears it is simply familiar, but to many English-speaking Americans, the word is foreign and strange, a sound that carries with it all the unease and prejudice reserved for those deemed outsiders. At first the plant passes mostly unnoticed. The United States already knows cannabis, after all, as an ingredient in some tinctures and patent medicines sold in apothecaries. But this way of consuming it, the smoking of its flowers, the association with poor brown-skinned laborers and refugees, ignites anxieties that have lain close to the surface all along. Newspapers in the border states begin to print stories. In them, marijuana is no longer a simple plant. It becomes a character in a morality play. Reporters write, often without evidence, of crimes committed under its influence, of laborers driven to madness and violence, of decent citizens threatened by this strange habit from the south. Cartoonists draw men with dark faces and wild eyes, their hands clutching cigarettes that seem to emanate not just smoke but evil intent. Carefully, sometimes subtly, sometimes openly, the message takes shape. This plant is not like the other crops. It is foreign. It is dangerous. It belongs to them, not to us. At the same time, in another corner of American culture, the plant finds different companions. In the jazz clubs of New Orleans, then Chicago, then Harlem, music is being born that bends time and space. Trumpets and saxophones thread through smoky rooms, pianos murmur and growl beneath voices that carry stories of love, loss, and endurance. Here, musicians, many of them black, many of them migrants themselves from the rural South, roll thin cigarettes filled with cannabis. They share them backstage in alleyways at small tables between sets. They speak of the way the smoke seems to loosen the tight knots of rhythm, how it opens up spaces within the music where new ideas can take root. For them, the plant is not a demon, but a quiet ally. It helps them endure long nights, grueling schedules, and the constant grinding pressure of racism. It softens the jagged edges of a world that barely acknowledges their humanity, even as it embraces their art. But in the eyes of a fearful, segregated society, this too becomes ammunition. The same newspapers that once praised jazz as a curious novelty soon warn that its rhythms are dangerous, that its origins in black neighborhoods and its association with cannabis pose a threat to white youth. A pattern unfolds, age-old and yet always newly devastating. The plant itself has not changed. It grows as it always has, from seed to sprout, from stalk to flower, under sun and rain, but the meanings wrapped around it shift like smoke in a troubled wind. Once a source of medicine and material, it is now being painted as a vector of moral and racial contagion. In America, especially in this era, such associations are heavy with consequence. Into this charged atmosphere steps a man in a dark suit, carrying a briefcase full of ambition. His name is Harry Jacob Anslinger. Anslinger is a bureaucrat by training, a man of order and hierarchy, of memos and reports. In 1930, he is appointed the first commissioner of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics, an agency born in the fading twilight of alcohol prohibition. The great national experiment of banning liquor is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Speakeasies thrive, organized crime has grown fat. The noble idea of improving society by outlawing a substance has become a lesson in unintended consequence. Yet the machinery built to enforce prohibition cannot simply be allowed to rust away. Its offices, its agents, its budgets must be justified. Anslinger understands this keenly. He needs a new enemy, a new substance around which to rally a crusade. He finds it in cannabis, or rather in marijuana, the foreign-sounding name that has already begun to circulate in the more sensational corners of the press. With a zeal that borders on the religious, he begins to gather stories. Some are real but exaggerated, many are apocryphal or invented outright. He collects every tale of violence, even loosely associated with cannabis use, binding them together into a narrative that will be repeated again and again until it acquires the weight of truth in the public imagination. A young man who commits a brutal crime becomes in his retelling a victim of marijuana's madness. Even if alcohol or mental illness played the true role, a tragic accident becomes evidence of a mind unhinged by the plant. Anslinger is a master of the era's media. He collaborates with newspaper magnates eager for scandal, men like William Randolph Hearst, whose vast chains of papers can transform rumor into national panic overnight. Together they promote lurid headlines warning of marijuana, assassin of youth, weed with roots in hell, and other fevered inventions. In these stories, Mexican laborers and black jazz musicians loom as shadowy figures just beyond the threshold of respectable society, their hands holding cigarettes that are portrayed as tickets to insanity and death. Before congressional committees, Anslinger speaks in a steady, confident voice. He warns that marijuana makes black men forget their place, that it incites them to violence, that it inflames their interest in white women. He shows no hesitation in using racial fear as fuel for legal fire. Science, at this point, offers little to support his claim. The American Medical Association objects to his broad condemnations, noting that cannabis has recognized medical uses and that the evidence of widespread harm is scant. But in the theatre of politics, fear speaks louder than measured analysis. In 1936, a low-budget film appears, Refer Madness. Financed in part by religious groups and embraced by Anslinger's crusade, it depicts young people descending into madness, rape, and murder after a single puff of marijuana. Its acting is exaggerated, its plot absurd, yet its message is clear. This plant, once a tool and medicine, is now an existential threat to the very fabric of society. The following year, under the weight of this orchestrated hysteria, Congress passes the Marijuana Tax Act of 19. On its surface it does not ban the plant outright, instead it wraps it in a web of permissions and stamps, of taxes and registries, so burdensome that legal trade becomes nearly impossible. Violations carry heavy penalties. Doctors who once prescribed cannabis tinctures for pain or insomnia now face paperwork so daunting and scrutiny so intense that most simply stop. Farmers who once grew hemp for rope and cloth see their fields empty, their seeds unsown. With the stroke of a pen, an ancient partnership is severed. The same plant that had helped build ships, eased pain, and threaded itself through rituals from China to India to Persia, is now marked as a pariah in the land that once cultivated it so eagerly. The language around it hardens. It is no longer hemp, the familiar crop. It is marijuana, the dangerous drug, the foreign contaminant. In the darkness of prison cells that begin to fill with those arrested for possessing, selling or growing it, a new chapter in the plant's biography begins. One written not in the soft ink of myth and remedy, but in the hard, angular script of criminal codes and sentencing guidelines. Decades turn. The world is engulfed in war, then reshaped by it. New nations rise, old empires crack. In the United States, the 1960s swell with protest and upheaval. Civil rights marches wind through southern streets. Students gather on campuses, chanting against injustice, war and the rigid moral codes of their parents' generation. In parks and crowded apartments, in communes and city lofts, a new generation encounters the cannabis plant anew. They roll it into papers and glass pipes, share it in circles, accompanied by guitars and record players. For many of them, the act of smoking becomes a small, fragrant rebellion against the rigid order imposed by their elders. They speak of how it shifts their perception, how colors seem deeper, music richer, how conversations unspool into territories they had never mapped before. Some find in it a companion for spiritual exploration, weaving it into an eclectic tapestry of Eastern philosophies, indigenous traditions, and experiments in consciousness. Others simply find that it soothes their anxiety in a time when the draft can pluck them from classrooms and deposit them in foreign rice paddies under an unfamiliar lethal sun. To the authorities watching this generational wave, cannabis seems less like a mere substance and more like a symbol, an emblem of resistance. While its actual harms remain modest compared to those of alcohol or tobacco, it becomes, in the rhetoric of the time, a stand-in for all the social transformations that unsettle the powerful, the questioning of authority, the mixing of races in public spaces, the rejection of conventional roles. When President Richard Nixon rails against the anti-war movement and the civil rights struggle, he speaks of law and order, and in that phrase, drugs and especially marijuana play a central if often unspoken role. In 1970, Nixon signs the Controlled Substances Act into law. This sweeping legislation classifies various drugs into schedules based on their perceived medical value and potential for abuse. Despite the long history of cannabis as a medicine, despite the relative mildness of its physiological effects, it is placed in Schedule 1, the strictest category, reserved for substances deemed to have no accepted medical use and a high risk of addiction. Heroin and LSD share this designation. Cocaine and methamphetamine are assigned to less restrictive schedules, a paradox that reveals the political nature of these classifications more than any coherent scientific logic. Nixon, uneasy with how central marijuana has become to youth culture, commissions a group of experts, the Schaefer Commission, to study the plant's actual effects and recommend policy. When they deliver their report, it does not conform to the president's expectation. They recommend decriminalization, finding that the harms of criminal punishment far outweigh any dangers posed by the substance itself. They suggest that adults using cannabis in private should not be subject to arrest and imprisonment. Their report is quietly buried. Nixon rejects its conclusions and presses forward with a more punitive approach. What follows in the ensuing decades is often called the war on drugs, but in practice it frequently becomes a war on vulnerable communities. Laws are passed that impose harsh, mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, including those involving marijuana. Police departments receive funding and equipment to pursue drug cases more aggressively. On television, public service announcements show images of fried eggs and smashed lives, insisting that even mild experimentation will lead inevitably to ruin. In the poor neighborhoods of American cities, places where jobs have vanished, where schools are underfunded, where opportunities are as rare as shade in a concrete desert, drug laws are enforced with particular ferocity. Young black and brown men are stopped, searched, and arrested at rates far higher than their white counterparts. Even though surveys consistently show similar rates of drug use across racial lines, courtrooms become conveyor belts feeding an expanding prison system, one that will grow into the largest in the world. Inside these prisons, under harsh fluorescent lights, men and women stare at cinder-block walls and metal bars, serving years, sometimes decades, for possessing or selling a plant that once graced imperial pharmacopeias and temple altars. Their absence ripples outward. Children grow up without parents. Communities lose wage earners, caretakers, mentors. The plant, which has neither malice nor intention, has become the pretext for a machine of human suffering. Yet even in this bleak landscape, cannabis continues to do what it has always done. It grows out of sight of law enforcement. It springs up in basements outfitted with humming lights, in remote clearings carved deep into forests, in closets and attics tucked behind false walls. Amateur botanists and dedicated cultivators begin to selectively breed it, favoring plants with higher resin content, brighter aromas, and more varied effects. They give their creations names as fanciful as any myth: skunk, northern lights, Afghan kush, and many more. The plant's physical form morphs under their care, growing bushier or more compact, its flowers dense with sticky trichomes that glitter like frost. At the same time, beyond the reach of mainstream acknowledgement, scientists in far-off laboratories begin to probe cannabis with the tools of modern chemistry and biology. In the early 1960s, an Israeli researcher named Raphael Mechoulam and his colleagues isolate delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, the primary psychoactive component of cannabis. They determine its structure, piece by careful piece, like archaeologists reconstructing a shattered artifact. Later, researchers discover other compounds in the plant: cannabidiol, CBD, cannabinol, CBN, and many more, each with distinct properties and potential uses. As the 1980s and 1990s unfold, another revelation emerges. Scientists identify a complex network of receptors in the human body that respond specifically to these cannabis compounds. They find CB1 receptors densely clustered in the brain and nervous system, CB2 receptors spread through the immune system and peripheral tissues. Further investigation reveals that the body itself produces molecules, endocannabinoids, that fit into these receptors, acting as messengers in processes as diverse as pain perception, memory, appetite, mood, and inflammation. In this way, cannabis offers humanity not only its own pharmacological gifts, but a key to a deeper understanding of our own internal chemistry. The endocannabinoid system, as it comes to be called, appears to be a kind of subtle tuning mechanism, helping maintain balance, homeostasis across multiple bodily systems. The plant's molecules, evolved for reasons known only to nature, fit into this system like forgotten tools rediscovered in an old chest. Once again, the line between medicine and intoxication, between remedy and recreation, blurs. The plant that politicians have named a poison reveals within itself the possibility of healing. It is against this backdrop that in the 1980s and early 1990s, a new and terrible illness emerges. In hospital rooms in San Francisco, New York, and other cities, young men, who had been strong and vibrant only months before, waste away with mysterious infections and cancers. Their immune systems, for reasons no one initially understands, are failing. The government's response is marked by denial, stigma, and delay. An entire generation of men, many of them gay, many of them artists, activists, and caretakers, find themselves abandoned by institutions that hesitate even to name the disease that is killing them. Amid this crisis, old knowledge surfaces in new clothing. Patients with AIDS, suffering from nausea, wasting, and pain, begin to discover that cannabis offers relief. Smoking a small amount before a meal can awaken an appetite that had vanished, making it possible to maintain body weight. It can quiet the relentless nausea caused by early antiviral drugs. It can ease the neuropathic pain that sometimes accompanies the disease. In their circles, the plant is not a criminal vice, but an act of mercy, sometimes the only thing standing between a man and utter despair. These patients do not have the luxury of abstract policy debates. They cannot wait for federal agencies to revisit decades-old classifications. Their need is immediate, their suffering visible. In San Francisco, a gay activist and cannabis dealer named Dennis Perron, having seen his partner die of AIDS, begins to advocate openly for the right of patients to access the plant. He helps to open the first public medical cannabis dispensary, despite the constant threat of arrest and closure. Others join him. A loose network of caregivers and activists forms, distributing cannabis to the sick under the banner of compassion, even as federal law continues to insist that the plant has no medical value. In 1991, the city of San Francisco passes a resolution urging the state of California to allow medical cannabis. 5 years later, in 1996, California's voters pass Proposition 2, the Compassionate Use Act, making it the first state in the nation to legalize cannabis for medical purposes. The measure is simple in its language and profound in its implications. It acknowledges, in the clear, practical voice of the ballot box, what shamans, emperors, monks, and patients have known for thousands of years, that this plant can be a medicine. The federal government, however, does not change course. Cannabis remains a Schedule I substance at the national level. Federal agents raid some dispensaries, seizing plants and records. Court cases mount, yet the tide, once turned, does not fully reverse. Other states watch California's experiment. Patients share their stories. Researchers, though constrained by legal barriers, publish studies suggesting that cannabis and its derivatives can help in conditions ranging from chronic pain and spasticity to epilepsy and the side effects of chemotherapy. In 2012, another threshold is crossed. Voters in Colorado and Washington approve measures to legalize cannabis not only for medical use, but for any adult who chooses to partake. For the first time in nearly a century, in parts of the same country where Anslinger once preached doom and where Nixon declared a war, fully legal cannabis markets begin to operate in the open. Storefronts appear, offering carefully labeled flowers, oils, and edible. Tax revenues flow into state coffers. The sky does not fall. Life continues. State by state, a map that once glowed with prohibition begins to sprout islands of green. Oregon, Alaska, Nevada, California again, this time for full legalization, then more, rippling outward across the years. At the same time, other nations chart their own paths. In the Netherlands, coffee shops have for decades quietly allowed consumption. In Uruguay, a small Latin American nation, the government takes the unprecedented step of creating a fully legal national system for cannabis production and distribution, aiming to undercut the black market and reduce violence. In Canada, festivals of maple leaves are joined by the lifted leaves of cannabis when the country embraces legalization in 2018. Yet even as some doors open, others remain firmly locked. In the United States, federal law still classifies cannabis as a forbidden substance with no accepted medical use. This creates a strange, twilight world. In one state, a person may walk into a bright, welcoming dispensary, show an identification card, pay sales tax, and leave with a bag full of cannabis products, all under the watchful eye of security cameras and tracking systems. In another, crossing an invisible line on a map, a person carrying that same bag may face arrest, jail, and the long shadow of a criminal record. Even within legal markets, the ghost of Anslinger walks the aisles, because banks that are subject to federal regulation fear charges of money laundering. Many cannabis businesses are forced to operate largely in cash, a relic of the underground economy now trapped within a system that is, in many states, legal and regulated. This cash-based existence brings its own risks: robberies, accounting difficulties, the ever-present sense that the ground beneath one's feet is not entirely solid, and there is another, deeper wound. The communities that suffered most under the old regime, the black and brown neighborhoods whose sons and fathers were swept into prisons for possessing or selling modest amounts of cannabis, often find themselves excluded from the new legal wealth. Starting a cannabis business requires capital, legal expertise, and connections, resources that generations of targeted policing and economic marginalization have stripped away. In some cities, equity programs attempt to address this, reserving licenses for those with past convictions or from certain zip codes. The intent is noble, the implementation is often halting, imperfect, tangled in bureaucracy. Meanwhile, well-funded investors, sometimes from industries far removed from the land, finance, technology, even former law enforcement, enter the field with ease. They buy cultivation facilities, open sleek dispensaries, launch brands with polished packaging and marketing. In glossy boardrooms, executives discuss market share, consumer demographics, expansion strategies. For them, the plant is an opportunity, a commodity in a global marketplace. It is here, in this contrast, that the dual nature of humanity's relationship with cannabis becomes almost painfully visible. For some, it remains a source of healing and solace, a medicine that eases the burdens of illness, trauma, and age. For others, it is a symbol of resistance, a reminder of the injustices of the past and the ongoing struggle for justice. For still others, it is an industry, a field of profit and growth. The plant itself remains indifferent. It does not choose who cultivates it or who is punished for its possession. It does not know which flags fly over the lands where it grows legally, and which over the lands where it is hunted. In recent years, movements have begun to press not only for legalization, but for repair. Calls for the expungement of old cannabis convictions grow louder. Some jurisdictions establish processes by which those burdened by past arrests can clear their records, allowing them to apply for jobs, housing, and licenses without the invisible shackles of criminal stigma. These efforts are uneven, often slow, and frequently inadequate. A law can change in a single legislative session, but the damage done by decades of enforcement, families separated, careers lost, wealth denied, lingers like a scar on the body of a nation. As scientists continue to explore the plant's properties, they find more nuances. Certain strains, high in CBD and low in THC, show promise in treating childhood epilepsies that resist conventional drugs. Parents who once feared the plant as a demonized drug now find themselves advocating for its availability to give their children a chance at a life with fewer seizures. Veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder report that cannabis helps them sleep, quieting the flashbacks and hypervigilance that conventional pharmaceuticals sometimes fail to address. Elderly patients with arthritis and insomnia discover that a small dose at night can make the difference between hours of tossing in pain and restful, restorative sleep. And yet, alongside these quiet stories of healing, there are also reminders of the plant's shadow side. Some people, particularly those with certain vulnerabilities, may find that heavy cannabis use worsens their anxiety or clouds their motivation. In a small subset, it may interact with genetic predispositions to trigger episodes of psychosis. Like any powerful substance, it is neither pure panacea nor unmitigated peril. It is, as it has always been, a tool whose effects depend on dose, context, individual constitution, and the social frameworks in which it is used. From the mists of ancient Central Asian river valleys to the fluorescent glare of modern dispensaries, from Scythian burial tents to hospital wards in San Francisco, from the rope walks of European shipyards to cramped prison cells in American cities, the cannabis plant has walked beside humankind as both servant and mirror. It has bound our ships and our wounds, adorned our rituals and fueled our fears. It has been praised as sacred, and condemned as sinful, cherished as medicine, and reviled as poison. If there is a lesson whispered in the rustle of its leaves, it may be this: the moral qualities we assign to plants, to substances, to tools, are rarely inherent in the things themselves. They arise from our own histories, our prejudices, our hopes and our fears. The seed carries no malice, the flower holds no prejudice. These are human inventions, woven around the plant like stories told over a campfire, repeated until they seem as solid as stone. And so, in this unfinished garden of our relationship with cannabis, much remains unresolved. Laws continue to evolve, markets expand and contract, research advances, movements for justice push against the inertia of institutions. Somewhere a farmer walks through a legal field of cannabis, brushing the sticky flowers with calloused fingers, thinking about the harvest. Somewhere else a person sits in a cell, their sentence not yet commuted, remembering the same scent and wondering how history can be so uneven in its judgments. The plant grows on, indifferent to all of this. It drinks the sunlight, draws nutrients from the soil, unfurls its leaves towards the sky. Under microscopes, its trichomes glisten, tiny factories producing complex molecules that will slip seamlessly into the deep, ancient machinery of the human body. In this quiet green labor, it does what it has always done. The rest is up to us.